an important economic gathering and important speeches. For more on the state and future of China-Russia ties, let's bring in Yuval Weber. He's Associate Professor at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, in the speeches, we heard the term multilateralism and those who fight globalism. One thing we did not hear was the name Donald Trump come up during the speeches. And the question and answer, yes. How important is this address and what can we take away from it?
Well, I think both Presidents Putin and Xi came in with basically two big issues. One message for the international audience is if the relations with the United States are troublesome at best, and the trade war might go on, sanctions might go on, that Russia and China may not have America, but they have each other. And so, Xi and Putin talked about how they're best friends, how they love each other, which is great, you know, for middle-aged men to find love at that age. But the second thing is that they also wanted to demonstrate to their own elites, their own bureaucracies, that all the troubles are probably going to continue for a while. So if you're in Beijing and you see President Xi talking about his best friend Putin, well, that's the message that you take, that we're serious with Russia and vice versa.
Now, President Xi, in his address, he said, I'm quoting here, humankind stands at the crossroads of history. It doesn't get much more important than that. And he was talking about sustainable development. How important is that going to be for China with its growing middle class, people who are demanding poverty and pollution be reined in?
So sure, so domestically, they need to make sure that pollution, particularly like in the cities, goes down. But when it also comes to sustainable development, for China and for Xi, the Belt and Road Initiative, broadly speaking, is the #1 development, both goal and tool that they have. And they know that in previous countries, when they're doing these big things, that there is a lot of unequal growth in the countries that they're going into. That exacerbates political problems. So for instance, if China goes into a country in Central Asia or in Africa, and the inequality rises, as an example, that creates political difficulties for China. So they want to try to avoid that to the maximum degree possible.
Now, building on that a bit, Russian President Putin said that the global economic model is in crisis right now. And he's urging bodies such as the United Nations and the G20 to step in. Firstly, what does he mean by in crisis, and how do you think that is going to be received, what Putin had to say?
Well, Putin doesn't like the fact that whatever the United States really does in terms of imposing sanctions, isolating Russia from international trade and politics, that Russia doesn't have too many tools basically in its belt to do anything about it. Really the only thing that Putin can do is become closer and closer to China. But of course, when we think about sort of the geopolitical, zero-sum power struggles, we see that effectively Russia is ceding its position in Central Asia to China, and that is also more or less happening around the edges of former Soviet Union as well. So though politically, Russia and China is the only thing that Russia really has, because both Russia and China share a common goal of basically resisting US pressure. But when it comes to these economic issues, Russia doesn't have too many options, and that's probably what is irritating Putin most of all.
There was discussion about trade wars and real wars that are going on, much of it directly or indirectly blamed at U.S. President Donald Trump. What do you make of this, and how is that going to be received? What is the big takeaway?
I think Putin at that point was really just trying to raise the temperature on all this, because the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the event that they were at, it was designed in order to increase Western investment into Russia. There isn't much Western investment coming into Russia because of sanctions, because of everything else that's going on. And so what Putin can do is go on his core strength, which is military power, and that he's trying to essentially reframe all of these trade issues and these economic issues as fundamentally military in nature. And if it's military in nature, then he wants to turn the tables on the West by saying, I have actually these tools which you don't, or you're not essentially strong enough or brave enough to use them. And as we've seen from like Crimea, Syria, Venezuela, etc., Russia is prepared to use these tools. And that's essentially the message that he's trying to bring.
Now, 5G obviously is going to be very important going forward. A lot of discussion about Huawei, but what I found was interesting was it was President Putin who was critical of Huawei being squeezed out of markets.
Sure, because he can then say, Russia, we've been squeezed out of markets in general, and you, China, have been squeezed out of markets in this particular thing that you hold very dear to yourselves, Huawei as well as technology. The U.S. is sort of the leading power in technology. China's making these inroads, and Xi's big message is, we are being unfairly kept out. And so what President Putin is trying to do is to say to Xi and to the Chinese, your issue in specific is my issue in general. And that's how we are such best friends at this age.
Great. I want to thank you very much, Yuval Weber, for coming in. Certainly
very much.
appreciate your insight.